Mark Reeves was a man who saved lives for a living, but he never expected to be the one in need of saving. His perfect marriage? A lie. His devoted wife? A master of deception. And the man she betrayed him with? Closer than he ever imagined. But Mark wasn't the type to break, he was the type to plan. And when the truth finally came to light, it wasn't just heartbreak on the line. It was payback. Stay with me because this is a story you won't forget. Mark Reeves pulled into his driveway, the weight of exhaustion pressing heavily on his shoulders. The past 48 hours had been a relentless cycle of emergency cases, sleepless tension, and the sharp tang of antiseptics. His body ached, his mind yearned for rest, but through it all, one thought kept him going. His upcoming anniversary with Emily Harper. 5 years of marriage deserved something special, and he had planned a surprise that would remind them both of the love they had built together. The house greeted him with an unsettling silence. Usually, Emily would have music playing or the television murmuring in the background. Instead, the stillness felt unnatural. His brow furrowed as he stepped inside, the faint murmur of a voice carrying from the kitchen. At first, it was just a whisper of sound, but then laughter rang out, soft, familiar, but tinged with an unfamiliar playfulness. Mark stood in the hallway listening. "Oh, Nicholas, you're terrible." Emily's voice lilted, warm and teasing. His grip on his briefcase tightened. That name, Nicholas Bennett. It had been slipping into conversations more frequently, always accompanied by a casual remark or an anecdote that seemed trivial on the surface. A work colleague, project partner, a harmless friendship. Yet, something about it had started to gnaw at Mark, a quiet unease that he had tried to push aside. Taking a breath, he stepped into the kitchen. Emily turned sharply, phone in hand, her smile flickering away like a candle snuffed by the wind. "Mark, you're home early," she said, her voice a fraction too high. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she pressed the call to an abrupt end. Mark studied her face. A flicker of something. Surprise, guilt, maybe even irritation, crossed her features before she composed herself. "How was work?" she asked, shuffling some papers on the counter, her focus deliberately elsewhere. "Busy."
À construction accident.
Almost lost a patient's arm. He waited for her to show the usual concern, the curiosity that had once been second nature. Instead, she simply nodded, her eyes distant. Mark leaned against the counter. "I was thinking about our anniversary next month. I made reservations at that vineyard you love." For a moment, she hesitated, then forced a smile. "That sounds nice. We can figure out the details later." The response was off. Usually, she would have peppered him with questions, excitement bright in her gaze. Now there was a gap, a void where warmth should be. "Everything okay?" Mark pressed. "Of course. Just work stress. You know how it is." She turned away, already reaching for her phone again. Mark exhaled, rubbing his temple. Maybe he was overthinking things. The exhaustion was making him paranoid. Shaking off the unease, he forced himself to drop it for now. "I'm gonna shower and get some rest." "All right," Emily murmured, barely glancing up. "Sleep well." As Mark climbed the stairs, a weight settled in his chest. Something was shifting, changing in ways he couldn't yet define. He told himself it was nothing, just fatigue, just stress. But deep inside, he already knew things were not the same anymore. Over the following weeks, the unease in Mark's gut only grew stronger. Emily's late nights at work became more frequent, her explanations vague and unconvincing. She would come home hours past her usual time, murmuring about last-minute meetings or unexpected project deadlines. When he asked questions, she responded with casual dismissals, as if the inquiries themselves were an annoyance. Then there was the scent, a cologne, bold, musky, distinctly masculine, clung to her clothes when she walked through the door one night past midnight. It was foreign, unfamiliar, and certainly not his. "Had drinks with some clients," she had said when he mentioned it the next morning. "One of those finance guys must have bathed in the stuff. You know how it is." He nodded but said nothing, though the explanation settled uneasily in his stomach. The logical part of his mind told him not to overreact, but a deeper instinct warned him not to ignore the signs. With work consuming most of his time, it was easy to push these thoughts aside. The emergency department was a whirlwind of chaos, a place where every second counted and the luxury of dwelling on personal issues did not exist. He poured himself into his job, saving lives, making split-second decisions that carried real weight. His colleagues respected him, his patients trusted him. And yet, the moment he stepped back into his own home, that trust, at least between him and his wife, felt increasingly like a fragile illusion. He tried to brush it off, tried to tell himself that he was imagining things. But the more he paid attention, the clearer it became. Emily was pulling away, slipping into a world where he was no longer invited. And no matter how much he wanted to believe otherwise, he could feel the truth pressing in, undeniable and cruel. Something was wrong, and it was only a matter of time before he found out exactly what. The changes in Emily's behavior became harder to ignore as the days passed. What once seemed like occasional distractions or stress-induced distance solidified into undeniable patterns. Mark Reeves wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but the signs were there, accumulating like pieces of a puzzle he wished he didn't have to solve. Late nights at the office turned into habitual absences. Meetings, last-minute client requests, deadlines, her explanations varied, but the theme remained the same. Mark would wake to an empty bed, check the time, and realize she still hadn't come home. At first, he convinced himself it was normal. Career-driven people had unpredictable schedules. But this wasn't unpredictability, it was avoidance. When she did come home, the lingering traces of unfamiliar cologne clung to her like a whisper of someone else's presence. It wasn't the scent of her usual perfumes or anything he had gifted her. It was bold, musky, undeniably masculine. He didn't confront her about it right away. Instead, he waited, observed, let the evidence pile up in quiet contemplation. One night, she arrived even later than usual. The digital clock on their nightstand read 1:47 a.m. Mark was already awake, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, when he heard the front door click shut. He closed his eyes for a moment before sitting up, the sheets rustling as he ran a hand over his face. The scent of wine mixed with that same cologne wafted into the bedroom as she passed by. "Long night?" he asked, his voice calm, measured. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Yeah. Client crisis. Nicholas and I had to stay late sorting things out." There it was again. Nicholas. The name had embedded itself into their conversations like an unwelcome guest, always present, always hovering just beneath the surface. Mark had never met the man, but at this point he felt like he knew him better than he wanted to. "Everything okay?" he asked, watching her intently. She nodded too quickly, kicking off her shoes and slipping under the covers with rehearsed ease. "Just exhausted. We'll talk tomorrow, okay?" Mark didn't press. He simply lay back down, staring at the ceiling once more. The truth was coming into focus, and the clearer it became, the less he liked what he saw. During the days, Mark buried himself in work. The emergency department provided a welcome distraction, an environment where chaos reigned, leaving no room for personal worries. He moved from case to case, his mind honed in on saving lives, making critical decisions, keeping people from the brink of death. But no matter how many patients he treated, no matter how many hours he spent in the ER, he couldn't erase the unease growing inside him. The worst part wasn't the suspicion itself. It was the waiting. The slow realization that something was slipping through his fingers and he wasn't sure if he wanted to catch it anymore. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling shift, Mark found himself scrolling through their shared calendar on his phone. Emily had been marking late meetings more frequently now, the gaps in her schedule widening like cracks in a once solid foundation. His thumb hovered over one of the dates. Friday, 8 p.m., client dinner. He sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He needed to stop pretending that he didn't already know the truth. It wasn't just the schedule. It was the way she smiled less, the way she barely touched him anymore. The absence of teasing remarks, of spontaneous affection. the slow unraveling of their bond, thread by thread. Mark noticed it in the little things, how she locked her phone before setting it down, how she turned away slightly when answering calls, the shift in tone when she spoke to Nicholas, the way she used to ask about his work, listen intently as he shared stories from the hospital, but now only offered distracted nods. It wasn't one big moment of betrayal, it was death by 1,000 small cuts. Yet he still held back. Perhaps part of him wanted to be wrong. Perhaps part of him wasn't ready to hear the truth spoken out loud. Then came the message. A simple text notification that flashed across Emily's phone screen one evening, as she left it unattended on the kitchen counter. Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing. Mark had never considered himself the jealous type. He prided himself on trust, on rational thinking. But as he stared at those words, a new emotion took hold of him. A quiet, cold certainty. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was proof. Emily came into the kitchen moments later, picking up her phone without a second glance. She had no idea he had seen it. Mark turned away, gripping the counter as he let the weight of the moment settle. He could have confronted her then and there, demanded explanations, forced the issue into the open. But no, not yet. Not until he was ready. He had spent years learning how to stay calm in the face of disaster. This was no different. Emily thought she was in control of the narrative. She had no idea that Mark was already planning his next move. Mark Reeves had always believed in logic, in reason, in finding the right moment to act. And now, as the evidence piled up before him, the time for waiting was over. His wife's betrayal was no longer a whisper in the back of his mind. It was a roaring certainty. He needed to see it with his own eyes. The evening of Emily's so-called client dinner arrived. She had left the house in a fitted navy dress, her hair styled to perfection, looking every bit the professional she claimed to be. Mark had watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable as she hurried out without a second glance. He already knew where she was going. A private investigator had provided him with a detailed itinerary of her movements over the past week. Each meeting with Nicholas meticulously logged. The restaurant tonight was no exception. An upscale venue known for its intimate ambience. The kind of place meant for whispered conversations and stolen glances, rather than business discussions. Mark arrived outside the restaurant, parking a short distance away. Through the large windows, he spotted them almost immediately. Emily and Nicholas sat close, their hands grazing as they laughed softly, the flickering candlelight illuminating their faces. She leaned in, the same way she had leaned toward Mark once, her gaze locked onto Nicholas with a familiarity that sent a deep chill through him. For a moment, Mark simply watched, absorbing the painful reality. The betrayal had already happened. Tonight was merely confirmation. The years they had built together, the vows spoken in earnest, the dreams shared late into the night. It had all led to this. A carefully constructed illusion crumbling before his eyes. He could have stormed inside, made a scene, demanded an explanation. But that wasn't who he was. He needed something more than confrontation. He needed closure on his own terms. Without another glance, he turned and walked away, already crafting the steps for what would come next. At home, Mark sat in the dim light of his study, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. His mind worked methodically, shifting into the same precision he used in the ER when faced with a crisis. This wasn't an emotional reaction. This was a procedure. By morning, the lawyer was contacted. Walter Daniels was known for handling high-profile divorces with ruthless efficiency, leaving his clients not only victorious but untouchable. Within the hour, Mark's financial advisor had also been briefed. Assets needed to be secured, accounts reviewed. He wouldn't allow Emily to walk away from this unscathed. The next step was personal. Mark had spent the last few weeks observing, collecting, waiting. Now he acted. He removed his wedding band, placing it inside the small mahogany box where it would remain. The symbols of their marriage, once precious, had lost their meaning. What had once been sacred was now nothing more than a reminder of what he had lost. Emily returned home late, as expected. The scent of cologne, not hers, not his, lingered in the air. She barely glanced at Mark as she walked past, her focus already on her phone, fingers moving swiftly across the screen. He didn't say a word. Not yet. There was power in silence. He simply watched, knowing that soon, everything she thought she controlled would slip through her fingers. She had rewritten the rules of their marriage. Now he would write the ending. Mark Reeves was not a man who acted impulsively. Every decision he made was calculated, every step planned in advance. The moment he walked away from the restaurant, leaving Emily and Nicholas lost in their own world, he had already determined how this would end. The morning after, he finalized everything with his lawyer. Walter Daniels wasted no time, initiating the divorce proceedings with the same ruthless efficiency that had made him one of the most feared attorneys in the field. Documents were drawn up, accounts examined, assets protected. Mark ensured that Emily would not be walking away from this unscathed. The next few days passed in a strange blur of detachment. He still went to work, still performed his duties in the ER with the same precision and dedication as always. But outside of the hospital, his world had become something mechanical, a series of actions leading toward the inevitable. Emily remained oblivious, continuing her charade, unaware that the foundations beneath her were crumbling. Mark allowed it. Letting her exist in her illusion a little longer gave him a quiet sense of control. Late at night, she came home as usual, carrying the scent of wine and unfamiliar cologne. Mark was already waiting in the living room, a single lamp casting a soft glow over the neatly stacked documents on the coffee table. He watched as she moved past him, reaching for her phone, barely acknowledging his presence. He remained silent as she settled in, scanning through messages, the flicker of the screen reflecting in her distant eyes. Papers slid across the table toward her. Divorce papers. Her fingers hesitated before picking them up. As her eyes moved across the text, her posture changed. The moment of realization hit her. Her world, so carefully constructed, was being dismantled before her very eyes. There was no need for words. The records spoke for themselves. Financial transfers, meetings with Nicholas, all meticulously documented. The evidence was irrefutable. There was no room for protest, no space for negotiation. Mark had prepared for every possible reaction, and none of them would alter the outcome. The silence stretched between them, heavier than any argument could have been. She lowered the papers, exhaling sharply. The tension in her frame was unmistakable. The weight of her choices had finally caught up with her. There was nothing left to say, no plea that would change what had already been decided. She could not undo what had been done. Mark stood, his presence unshaken. His decision was final, unmovable. He had allowed her to rewrite the rules of their marriage. Now he was writing the ending. He left her there, alone in the dimly lit room, surrounded by the wreckage of what once was. For the first time in weeks, he felt something close to peace. Months passed, and Mark Reeves adapted to his new reality. The divorce had been swift, ruthless, and final. Emily had fought for what little ground she had left, but with Walter Daniels handling the case, there had never been a doubt about the outcome. The house was sold, accounts were settled, and what had once been a shared life had been reduced to a series of legal transactions. Mark moved into a sleek apartment in the heart of the city. It was smaller, quieter, but it belonged to him alone. He filled the space with clean lines and open windows, a stark contrast to the suffocating weight of his past life. The absence of Emily's presence was not a void. It was freedom. At work, he thrived. The hospital had promoted him to chief of emergency medicine, a position that demanded more of his time but gave him a sense of purpose. His colleagues respected him, his patients trusted him, and for the first time in years, he felt in complete control. The chaos of the ER was grounding. There was no space for past regrets, only forward momentum. Emily, on the other hand, had faded from view. She had moved into a modest apartment on the other side of the city, far from the life she had once built alongside him. Nicholas was no longer in the picture. Whatever fantasy they had constructed had crumbled under the weight of reality. One evening, after a grueling shift, Mark found himself at a quiet cafe near the hospital. The air was crisp, the city alive with movement, but for the first time in a long while he wasn't thinking about work. He was simply present. A woman at the counter caught his eye, poised, confident, with an air of quiet strength. She was reading a book, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee. Their eyes met for a brief moment before she returned to her page, unaware of the shift in the air. Mark exhaled, a slow realization settling over him. The past no longer held him. The betrayal, the anger, the carefully constructed plans for revenge. It was all behind him. He had survived, rebuilt, and emerged stronger than before. That night, as he returned home, he felt something unfamiliar yet welcome: peace. The ghosts of his past no longer haunted him, and for the first time in a long time, the future felt like his own.